Ravi's, I'm delighted here to be introducing, I had the privilege of introducing the opening keynote, and now I have the privilege of introducing our closing keynote to two friends of mine who have a very strange connection that I will describe in a minute. Ravi said that I could go ahead and embarrass JP as much as I want. And as much as I would like to do that, I can't, because JP has a lot of embarrassing things that he can share about me, and so we have a mutual pact here that we won't do that. So I'm just delighted, on a more serious note, I'm delighted to be introducing our closing keynote, JP. JP has had an illustrious career that has traveled in a lot of different directions. He went to school at St. Xavier's in Calcutta, which was of particular interest to me because we actually both were in school at the same time. He was 1 year my senior. He was in the last batch of the 11th grade, the old system, and I was in the first batch of the new ICSE 10th system. So I lost touch with JP since then. We'll come back to how we reconnected. But he went on after that and first went into a foray into journalism with a family-owned business called, a newspaper called the Indian, magazine called the Indian Finance. After that, he served as a consultant with Burroughs and Data General, Capgemini, and then more recently, he's also had a lot of important and very prestigious posts. He had 3 very important posts at British Telecom, serving there as a CIO, serving there as a MD for design, and then chief scientist. He moved from there to Salesforce, where he was also the chief scientist, and then most recently, he moved to Deutsche Bank, where he was the chief data officer and the group head of innovation. Along the way, he also became a member of the Web Science Trust in 2009, and that was the strange time when Wendy says, "Oh, I know this guy JP, and I've invited him to come and talk to us about possibilities," and lo and behold, I'm sitting there and I go, "I know you. We went to school together back in India all these years ago," and so it was a very strange way in which Wendy brought our connections back again. He holds 2 positions right now. He's retired from Deutsche Bank, but he is an adjunct professor in electronics and computer science at the University of Southampton, which makes him one of Wendy's colleagues. And he also, on his Facebook page, has announced another title, and that starting in October 2018, he was grandfather in training. So I welcome JP to tell us and give us his synthetic wisdom about everything that we have been thinking about for the last couple of days.
Thank you, Nash. I'm allowed to call him Nash. Having worked in some form of computing for the last 40 years, I remember very early on being told, it would be quite easy if it wasn't for human beings. The systems are sort of predictable, and they are largely controllable. They are functions and outputs that man is involved in. And it's a bit like a service organization saying if it wasn't for customers, actually life would be quite easy. Right? Human beings complicate things. But actually, to me, that's where web science starts getting interesting, because it's the ability for us to say we're building this representation that is no longer just systematic or mathematical, but needs to take on a human dimension. And we're not particularly good at that, okay? My easiest sort of form of trying to say, what is web science, when people ask, and we're still discussing and arguing it because it's an emergent topic. And the idea of saying, well, it must be to do with connectivity because it's web, and it must be to do with communications because that's how the data exhaust gets created that you can apply the science to. And you build the models to be able to try and test that, but a lot of this you could turn around and say doesn't exist, doesn't mean anything if it wasn't for people. So when I think about what I've been listening to for the last 2 days, and it's been fascinating for me because different groups of people have said, I'm going to unpack the linguistics, I'm going to unpack some of the motivations, I'm going to unpack the lying capability, I'm going to unpack some of the behaviors, but we're all actually trying to say we're modeling ourselves, okay? And we are hard to model. If it wasn't for us, we wouldn't have this. And as soon as I go down that path, part of what I start asking myself is, okay, why are we here? You know, if we had 2 days of a symposium, you start saying, okay, so are we actually here because we want to celebrate having found some really interesting ways of solving some very interesting problems? And is that where it stops? Because if that was the case, there could be classes the world over, symposia the world over on many topics, and there wouldn't be any difference. So why is it web science? And why would it attract, why are you guys in the room? Why am I here? And part of that for me is answering the question, well, we're all here because we want to do something to move forward the progress of human beings, to make this world a better place, to put a dent in the universe, as Steve Jobs was wont to say. But the point is, that's a nice thing to do. That's like saying, we would all want to sort of, lose weight and get fit and stuff like that, but it's motherhood and apple pie. How do we actually bring that to life? And in trying to frame that, why is it important? From the day that Wendy spoke to me first about web science, my initial response was, the problems we face in this world today, and this was like a 10-year-ago response, problems to do with climate change, problems to do with nutrition, with water, with health and our well-being, with our capacity to deal with disease, whatever the problem we looked at, these were not problems that were going to be solved as point problems in a single location across a single culture, right? It required us to collaborate across time zone, across location, across language, across culture. Therefore, tools that were designed to be able to help us share and collaborate, that gave us a frame of reference that acted outside the cultural biases or the silos that we build around ourselves, became important. The institutions that we used to have for solving this were largely dreamed up before and at the end of one world war, came to some form of maturing between two world wars, and then crystallized and fossilized shortly after. Right? They're no longer fit for purpose for what we're trying to do now. Right? They're tough to be able to deal with it because we live in a world that's moved, 70-odd years on from that, and we're hyper-connected, okay? The connections that we represent have grown in sort of an exponential basis compared to what we used to do. Everything and everyone is a node on the network. Everything is a sensor and an actuator. Our capacity to generate data is not 1,000-fold, but 1,000,000-fold and 1,000,000,000-fold what, we used to be able to. So the tools that we need, even from a technical sense, are no longer fit for purpose, and we are having to work at it. Much of what we've heard the last couple of days are people saying, this exhaust exists, but how can we make this exhaust valuable to try and solve a single point somewhere? And actually, in most of the cases, one of the resounding answers I saw, and I was glad it started with Wendy's keynote, but carried on all the way through, repeated through it, Nosha, and pretty much every speech in between, is we can't do it ourselves, meaning the technology alone is not going to solve it. It needs human beings to be able to intervene beyond. So I'm sort of putting my cards on the table. I'm a Kevin Kelly kind of fan. Kelly used to ask, why does invention take place? Why does innovation take place? Saying first and foremost, it's because there's a problem to solve, right? Necessity is the mother of invention. The second is because you see an observed effect. You know, the jet engine is a classic example of a problem to solve. If you wanted to get somewhere faster, fly longer, you have to do something to the engines of the past, so you build something new. Right? Velcro is a classic example of taking an observed effect and applying it somewhere else. Saying, you know, dog, fur, burr, the high cohesion, loose coupling, you can remove the burr from the dog's fur without damaging either. Let's try and replicate that. But he went further, and Kelly said, one of the reasons for us to have technology is to speed up evolution. And I loved that idea. I really loved it, saying I could go through generation after generation of being shot or shooting people in order to get our skin bulletproof. And after a couple of millennia and a lot of deaths, we'd probably get there. Alternatively, we could invent Kevlar. Okay? So there are choices that we make about the speed at which we could arrive at evolutionary acceleration for things. And I see that, for me, the web and what it represents is that the beginnings of a bound of acceleration, because the problems that were being generated weren't going away. We've had 70-odd years of this digital infrastructure rollout taking place, what some people term the big shift, saying public policy changes and digital infrastructure allowance has completely transformed the world we live in. And we've also come to a point why I called my talk, you know, why web science is important now, you know. Part of the reason for that is to say, we've also seen through the presentations, the papers and the conversations over the last couple of days, that we're seeing many of the effects of these magical things being not that magical. Okay? We've had problems in terms of our political systems being challenged. We've had problems in terms of terrorism or drug running or child abuse all being driven into this environment. In fact, one of the reasons why I think Wendy was saying Tim Berners-Lee is so insistent on wanting to improve the web and go through work like Solid, etc., is because the things that the web represents have had their fair share of bad press, shall we say. Not all the uses of the web are positive or useful. However, I still remain that optimist, and part of the reason for my standing up here in front of you say, there are some laws and some sayings that keep me alive and afloat as I focus on this. One which I want to remind all of you of, I hope you've heard it before, but if you haven't, please listen. It's a law created by a guy called Roy Amara. Fundamentally said that human beings tend to greatly overestimate the impact of a technology in the short run and then underestimate it in the long run. So we seem to forget the first phone call, whether using a mobile phone, was made in the early 70s, before most of you were born. And by the time that mobile phone was in the hands of the common man, as it were, the common woman, it was the late 90s. So there was a gap of 20-odd years, nearly 30 years, before the technology became visible and active. The same is true for email. The first email was sent around 1971. By the time people started using them, and I hate email, but by the time it took traction, it took something like the BlackBerry, the idea that you could have asynchronous delivery, that you could choose the time and place that you managed to get a message. You could store it somewhere and have it forwarded to you in the right form. And all these technologies, when they make a shift, it takes time. And Amara's law is a reminder that we're only still in the early stages of web science. We still have to work through to the next stages of it. The next law that I really like is, probably showing my age or my attitude. It's a quote from Douglas Adams, who says that people tend to consider all the environment they're in at the time they are born up to the age of 18 as normal. Okay, there is an acceptance that normal gets defined by what you experience till the age of 18. And then from the age of 18 to the age of 35, what you experience is seen as progressive. And after the age of 35, everything you progress is a waste of time, is a real pain, comes in your way. But that's for the over 35s in the audience, and there are a few. Right? But we create our own biases. We create our inability to take things on. And it's important to understand that. And then the same Kevin Kelly I sort of quoted earlier, he also said that a traditional technology, a legacy technology, fails in reliable and predictable ways. New technologies fail in ways that are unexpected, that surprise you, and that you're not prepared for. But they fail less often. Okay? We are in that kind of environment about so much that we see, because for the first time in our lives, we're able to break away from a lot of the emotion and the politics and the biases around and start building a real discipline towards using data that represents us and our extensions as being sensors of that data, as being actuators of that data, and then applying scientific discipline, saying, how are we going to store this? How are we going to label this? How are we going to clean this up? How are we going to form this? And a lot of what we've been doing has been to do with that, and a lot of the discussions that we've had. And why is that important? Because if you look around in any country you want to right now, and you try and give a scorecard for whether it's fake news or fake elections or fake positioning in markets or for fake statements on health or fake statements on nutrition or whatever else, there is a lot of that there. And the only answer that we have is to be able to have tools that allow us to discover truth, to be able to share that truth, and to be able to share that truth in a way that we are actually able to convince people. We're moving from a broadcast model to a peer-to-peer model in so many things we do. But it takes time. It's not that the internet has failed or the web has failed or the mobile environment has failed. Yes, along the way, we have failed. I mean, there was an Iranian blogger who, for a tweet, got imprisoned for 8 years. And when he came out, he said, "What a strange world I live in." I'm paraphrasing him. I went to jail leaving an internet of books, and I've come back into a cable internet. And the loss of certain freedoms that are in the way we have architected the provision of the web and the internet and connectivity on mobile devices, and the controls we placed on that are barriers to some of the creativity that we used to be able to have. Why is all this important? Okay, we've already reached a stage where I hope you understand, one, there are problems on this earth that will not be solved unless we can find tools, capabilities, principles, and processes, policies, people to be able to act. So multidisciplinary, without the traditional numerate alone discipline, being able to bring in other disciplines to collaborate, to work, are going to be part of the solution. The second is that problem is real, clear and present danger now. Many of us live in environments where the world we live in has already been corrupted by not just misuse of the tools, but an inability for us to be able to solve some of that in the short run. Right? Many of the presentations were actually to do with how we can use technology to try and contain some of this damage. But it's not damage. I mean, I'm standing out here having had a major heart attack nearly 12 and a half years ago, and I have a bivent 3-lead ICD in me. And every day I'm amazed that not just I am alive, but that technology allows me to be alive. Right? I managed to convince the medical profession to give me read access to the device. For some crazy reason, they wouldn't let me have write access. Right? But it's a lot of fun when you're testing the device. So I've had a little bit of write access to it, but only under very controlled circumstances. We live in an age where if you haven't read Wendy's paper on the four internets, which you also referred to in the talk, we're seeing a fragmenting and a set of controls, some by state actors, some by non-state actors, where our ability to have this global, connected, hyper-connected, collaborative universe is being tested. At the same time, a lot of tension is being placed around what personal data means and how it can be used, because there's the classic asymmetry of public good and private harm in order to be able to solve some of the problems by being able to aggregate that data. And events like the creation of Solid are just processes towards saying, how can we improve personal control and agency across these things? Right? We will get more agency across all this. But in getting that, we have new problems to solve. Because how do you then get permissioned access to aggregating that very data that's fragmenting even further? If you think that we have 7 billion places to go to for that data, and we have to negotiate permissions at speeds that still allow us to be able to come up with valid outcomes. And the movement towards a more real-time environment is also continuing. So these are not sort of trivial issues. And as we've gone into this non-monolithic structure for how technology works, the attack surface is also going out of traditional control. Right? When I was at Salesforce, one of the things that it amazed me was saying one code base, okay? Not a set of VMs, not sort of device risked at the edges. And attack surfaces are becoming very, very important when you look at the hyper-networked world, and when you have the devices and then you have the impact of IoT sort of extending that device set. How to actually prevent leakage of data, how to prevent attack, how to carry on with these things being safe. Okay? They're non-trivial. Right? Only yesterday or day before I was reading about there's a guy called George Gilder who said quite famously in the 80s that every economic era is characterized by its own unique abundances and its own unique scarcities. And people and businesses who take advantage of both the scarcities as well as the abundances will succeed. And we live in a world where, privacy has become a scarcity, attention has become a scarcity, but connectivity has become an abundance, right? And we have many issues that come out through that, and the fakeness, which is in corporate life and personal life and public life and politics and news, etc., is at the end, news is nothing more than a class of data. You still want to talk about how that data is collected, you want to know how it's corroborated, you want to understand the source. You have to have some idea of immutability. You have to know that the labeling has been correctly carried out. Right? All of this is still the same disciplines we want to use from data anywhere else. But as you do that, part of the challenge that occurs is saying, well, who's going to be able to do this at this rate? And we talked about, using AI to be able to help deal with it. And over the last couple of days, we came to the conclusion, not quite, but it is useful. Many of the technical tools are sort of necessary but not sufficient to be able to solve the problems. We still have roles to play within that. Well, by the time you take into account that this environment that could, with our help us solve some of the problems that we see, to try and make this world a better place, and we realize we're under threat in terms of the use of raw materials that represents, whether you look at its energy or whether you look at rare earths. We're under threat about the ability to store that energy and make it useful even if we go into renewables. We're being attacked in terms of the cyber risk. We leak the data and create privacy issues. The people who are sitting down to try and curate all this are also, if you read, as I did very recently, about the lives of people who are now trying to go through to test and find the fakenesses and the more criminal aspects of this, their lives aren't much fun. Okay, and we have to look at the longer-term effects psychologically of saying if that's what you see every day. When I, many years ago when I gave my TED talk, I sort of said, well, if you read the same biased newspaper for 30 days in a row and you read absolutely nothing else, would that be a supersize me for your brain? Not realizing just how much that kind of conditioning was taking place. Right? The narrower your focus of what you're exposed to, the more likely it is that you know better because that's what you've conditioned. Well, now we have machines going through that same problem. So whether it's bias, whether it's corruption of data, whether it's attack on that data, whether it's the cost of storing and maintaining that data, whether it's the willingness and wantingness to gain that data and how it reaches, we're in this quandary whereby the very tools we need to help us solve the problems we face as humanity are tools that are currently under attack. What we represent, what this symposium represents, what web science represents, is a set of people who are committed to saying we will use the tools of this connected world to help find what truth is and to be able to learn from that truth, to inform policy based on that, to help design products and services as a result, and get us to the stage where the gaming of many of these things that has been taking place the last 10, 15, 20 years is effectively a blip in the technological advances. Okay? Now, by definition, I've put my heart in my sleeve and shown you guys that I'm quite the optimist. Right? Well, if you were born in the 50s, grew up in the 60s, have still a little bit of pinko lefty, tree hugger, hippie left in you, right? I believe that we have that capacity. I start with the belief that human beings are fundamentally good. And I start with the belief that technology is fundamentally good because we are building it. I don't think of the dystopia quite as often as others, saying most of these dystopias are short-term. We've had dystopian statements about books, about the press, about radio, about television, about the car, about factory, you name it, we've had dystopian statements. I don't need more bad news. Right? God knows that, I can't read a paper without looking at, all the reasons to commit suicide before you finish reading the sentence. Right? I don't just need good news, but I'm required to be part of a society that provides that good news to future generations. We are stewards of everything that we have. Right? We are not owners. And in that stewardship, we have a responsibility to future generations to do it. You guys here, right? It's an us. You represent a commitment in that form through the skills that you represent, the experience that you have, the opportunities that you're given. Right? I can claim I'm not quite shuffled off this mortal coil. I expect to get another 20 years in. But the grandfather in training has 2 grandchildren, and I love my time with them. I love my time with my children, and I love the time I'm spending on web science. Thank you very much for your time.
You told about innovation, that what innovation on technology is going on in our society. So when we come to when we see a problem in our society, so we go curious into that. So what do you think? Should we think about when you thought about a solution? Should you according to you, should we think about more into will the project succeed or will the idea fail? What do you think we should think about?
Okay, I've always tried to measure any form of innovation through adoption. Okay, it is in use, it's in the iteration of use that you learn, the feedback loops that you get from that usage. So I don't think of it as digital, success or failure. I much rather say get it out, see it in use, and it may not go in the exact direction that you intended when you started, but to say that you will try and hold it to have a perfect answer wouldn't necessarily be the way I see it. I also think that when I tried to give the three examples, they're saying there is a necessity that you try to fill, there is an observed effect you try to transfer, or there is a much more sort of general ability to speed up evolution in order to get to some goal. These things are not timed in a request-response kind of manner. Okay? The best example I can give you is there was a Scottish scientist who was sitting in his back garden, and he heard on the radio that the Titanic had sunk. And that got him really angry because he could not believe in that day and age, 1912, they were not using technology to be able to spot icebergs to be able to prevent it. The work that he did got into the First World War on sonar and then on to radar. By the time my life experienced it, a part of that technology was being used for me to be able to see my first child, because the way that a child's photograph was being formed while she was still in my wife's stomach was using an extension of that technology. Some years later, when I developed kidney stones, the lithotripsy was using an extension of the same technology. Right? A few years later, because I was growing older and I did something to my knee, the ability to put physio on my knee was an extension of the same technology. So what was it about that professor getting angry about one incident, creating a whole slew of positive good? So sometimes, you're going to invent something, you're going to find something where you don't know what it's going to be used for at the time. But what is much more important is, well, you then don't have to scale it out. You don't have to spend all the money to say, I'm going to get dressed up when I don't know what I'm going to do with it. But the learning, the ability to change what humanity has learned about it, our body of knowledge has gone up that little inch. And that will come in useful even if 100 years later. So please keep going, keep doing what you're doing.
Okay. Who wants to follow? Okay, we are now we are part of, this is what I call part of the Web Science Fitness Program. So from one end to the other.
I'm going to ask a slightly different question. We keep hearing data theft regularly nowadays. And I guess I spend a lot more time nowadays in the healthcare industry. And one of the things that I'm taking for granted as a mental model is that all our data is going to get stolen at some point, because if the big guy who outspends everybody can't look after it, what's a small guy going to do? Have you got a point of view on, do you think that, does it matter if it gets stolen? Because there's clearly some stuff that's going to get stolen that's going to hurt you.
Now this is I know it's being recorded. I'm having to learn how to contain my answer on that, but I will do my best. I'm not known for being particularly diplomatic. If you go back to the mindset of people claiming that my name, my mother's maiden name, and my date of birth were seen to be security tokens in some form or shape, right? That was ridiculous. Because that meant that anyone who was famous, whose date of birth was known everywhere, whose mother's name was known everywhere, had no privacy in that form. So we were using security tokens, as it were, that were odd. When I was working for boroughs in the early 80s, we built ATMs. And there were people in this world who thought that in order to draw money, you're going to stand in the rain and stick your eyeball into a laser scanning device in order to provide your identity. Right? Today, if you actually look at what people are being asked to do with passwords, right? More and more complex passwords and then password managers and all that, saying we're doing a lot of things apparently to wrap protection around data, but not one of them sounds vaguely person-friendly. Okay? You know, it's not that everyone's stupid and that's why you wrote your password on a yellow sticky. Say, why did we need that kind of passwording? So, first question I'm saying is this, this practice that we've got about how we protect things still has some way to go. The second element is that the children of today, right, all three of my children are so-called millennials. Their idea of what may be private, etc., you know, it's the people of my age trying to use Facebook who fail, as it were, who don't know how to look after privacy. You know, children are quite capable of, they have Facebook birthdays, right? They share things that they do that aren't true. They create, you know, they fight against filter bubbles by making selections that do not reflect necessarily who they are. So they're already sort of street smart. Therefore, all this information everyone's meant to have about them, some of that information isn't true, right? Then to add to that, the fact that the information that is collected, without any effort, you know, if you tell me you really think that all your medical records today, in this wonderful 21st century, are all pretty largely accurate, sequentially timed, correctly stored, labeled properly, I'd say, well, you have a utopian view of your data, I've seen mine. Right? We have some way to go for these things. So, for the first thing I wanted to attack is saying our protection mechanisms are actually quite primitive, and the quality of the data is not necessarily that great. However, I do want to see agency of that data, but it's not going to happen overnight, because being able to build towards that, you know, takes a while. It's like how long it took for people to stop putting money under their mattress and entrusting physical storage before they went to saying, well, a digital store. Right? Now people trust these things, but that trust is built over 60, 70 years, not over 1 or 2 months. So I think we will get there. I think it will take, you know, this is an Amara's law. I think it will take longer than we'd want to, or than we would expect. But the direction is right, and we'd also learn, you know, not to keep so much garbage. Okay? We all have to become, there's a bit of Marie Kondoing that we have to do with our own data. Right? It's like saying we discovered that we could take photographs. Okay? Now, once we discovered we could take photographs, who can find a photograph quickly? Okay? Because we've all got thousands. So we have now an abundance of those things. Right? People try to do an analysis how many passwords someone has, the number of services you have. Right? We have some disciplines to form ourselves. So by the time you take that sort of triangulation, the technology has to improve and has to be friendlier to human beings. The data itself needs to be, shall we say, weeded, so that we're not having to look after quite so much, so we understand what's important. And we ourselves have to consider what disciplines we want to be able to bring.
So there was a reason I asked each of the panelists to join us today. So I don't need to introduce them because we already heard them before. And so I asked Wendy Hall because she, more than anyone else, has the experience of bringing together the web science community around the globe. So she can give us, as we call in the IIT lingo, gyan, wisdom. And so Vasudev Verma, because Vasu has been pretty instrumental in bringing researchers together in India. He has had great success in bringing the software engineering community together, and also he was one of the initial movers of bringing the data science community together in India. And Niloy, because he has already made several attempts at bringing the web science, network science community in India to a single platform. We have been doing multiple workshops, and there is a very, very successful social networking workshop that runs as part of CompsNet, and Niloy was the primary moving force behind that. And Niyati, because See, there are big conglomerates which try to have platforms in which academicians come together, but they always try to control the narrative. And Adobe is one of the very few companies which is actually willing to plug into the larger community and help build the community, and not necessarily try to stay in control of the narrative, but actually mingle with the community and help us grow. And I think that's fantastic, and so I would like you to represent the industry viewpoint on how this can happen. And I'm going to request each of the panelists to give a couple of minutes of opening statements, and then we will have more of a free-form discussion. We'll start with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you again, Ravi, for organising this, and for everyone for coming. And Srinivasa from Bangalore, I think, was the first place I spoke at about web science. Nasir and I were part of a workshop at Infosys. Infosys were one of our original backers in web science. This is 10 years ago, probably. We talk. I mean, JP's talk was Web Science Now More Than Ever. That was actually something. It was a CACM article we did on 10 years of web science. Now, we actually, the thing we always stumble on when we're talking about web science is the name, because so many people Tim Berners-Lee wanted to call it. This was in 2004 in his office. He wanted to call it philosophical engineering because he'd done physics as natural philosophy at Oxford, and to him this was like, how do we build things in the knowledge of what people may or may not do with them, or may not want to do with them? That was why. But we didn't think people would get that. We actually desperately wanted to call it psychohistory. And if you know your Asimov, and if you don't, then look it up, then that's what this is all about. In a way, it's become more scarily about it as we go forward. But again, we didn't think that would be understood and interpreted well around the world. So we picked on web science, and I always say there are two things wrong with the name web science. One is web and the other is science. Because web implies we're only thinking about the World Wide Web. And actually, as Danny Weitzner always remembers, by web we meant connectivity. We couldn't have called it network science because the network scientists had already got that name, and we weren't doing network science in terms of the way it was being formulated. We might have called it connectivity science on reflection. As I said yesterday, Sandy Pentland calls his group that, or he did the last time I looked at his group at MIT. They do very similar types of work to us. But again, I think that would have been misinterpreted in a way. I think whatever we called it would have been misinterpreted because, or actually we did also think about webology. That was the other one, webology. And we just thought that was such an ugly word. But it might have, because it was a new word. Ted Nelson of Hypermedia fame always said, come up with a new word, don't use. And the analogy I use often when talking to audiences, particularly students, about web science, is that it's like climate science. You are very few people, you can't do climate science without pulling on lots of different disciplines. You have to talk to the oceanographers, you have to talk to the people who do study the atmosphere, you have to talk to the people who study glaciers, you have to talk to the people who study meteorology. You cannot understand the climate without pulling all those things together and doing interdisciplinary work. And the hard thing, and this is where I'm coming to with my points, the hard thing about web science is doing it as an interdisciplinary subject. And we've had some wonderful talks, and we've been sort of putting them on a scale of 1 to 10 as to how web sciencey we thought they were. And this is very subjective. There's no absolute answer to any of this. My yardstick on web science, and this is how the conference has been set up. We have a ACM Web Science Conference, which makes some people think it's all about computer science because it's ACM. We try really hard at the Web Science Conference to make sure all the papers come from are interdisciplinary in their approach to what they're doing. And the problem with that is that the social scientists don't want conference papers, and the computer scientists want conference papers, and the philosophers want something else. The social scientists will often say, I'll put my paper in this conference, but you can't publish it. Right? I mean, it's as much as that, and it's really, there was a lovely talk yesterday, I don't expect she's still here, the social scientist from IIIT Bangalore, I'll see her tomorrow. Yeah, I'll see her tomorrow. And she said, I'm nervous to talk about social science in the company of all these computer scientists. But that's what web science is about. So you should, all of you who've given a paper, given a presentation, you should think, did you do that work with someone in a discipline other than your discipline? Because if not, I would say, my judgment is, you're down the low end of the web science spectrum. Because really, there's been a lot of talk about elections. Did you talk to political scientists before you wrote your paper? Did you work? If you've done stuff about analysing social networks, was there a social scientist anywhere in your study? I've done co-supervision of students with social scientists, and I doubt there are many in this room. Hands up, social scientists in this room. Nosh, and anyone else? I'm guessing you're most, well, yeah, JP. I sort of learnt a bit, these two in the front. Yes. Yes. But I'm just looking around here, right? So I'm just, this is the. I need to come to an end of these talks. But the thing I learned by co-supervising PhD students. So we have, as I said, our program of PhD supervision. The students have to have at Southampton supervisors from different disciplines, and the problem with that is so hard to manage in a university. Companies manage it easier, actually, to bring different disciplines. But the universities find that really hard because we're judged by the metrics in our silos. But also, you have to learn each other's culture. Because we use the words ontologies. Computer scientists have a completely different meaning of that to what the social scientists have. And the number of terms that you think are just English words that are the same, and they mean different things in different subjects. And the inspiration I've had for my work, working with, learning about Bourdieu theory, which was mentioned yesterday, I think, and so I had a student who applied that to his. He was a software engineer, and he learnt Bourdieu theory. That was incredibly difficult, but it's only when it's at the cusp of those disciplines that you really get the insights. So when you're doing the work on elections, if you talk to the political scientists, they will give you an idea of what words to look at and how to, what to analyse and how to interpret your results. And I'm not trying to tell you how to suck eggs, right? I'm just saying that to me, when you're judging on the spectrum of web science, it's the interdisciplinary thing that makes it different to data mining or social network analysis, or it's the truly interdisciplinary. And that's the plea for us, India, is that and you've done it here, Ravi, you've pulled together, we've had some amazing presentations that have really pulled together different disciplines, or at least been inspired by different disciplines. And that is the key thing, the key about getting web science going in a country like India is how you can give people permission to do that. I could say more, but I should shut up for a minute and pass the mic to...
Talking about fostering not just the web science community, but any community in India is incredibly hard. All of us know pretty well, because there are few people trying to do everything. And if you go to, whatever the conference, they're the same set of people that you keep meeting, right? It's not that there's not work going on, but maybe let me give you a slightly different perspective on perhaps to accelerate things based on whatever the little experience that I had in basically connecting people in common platforms. Web science is particularly very exciting because of two reasons. One is, if you are actually looking at web as an alternate world where there is a lot of objects, but are there in the virtual world, and people are interested in studying those objects, studying the behavior of those objects, and then the interactions between these objects and so on. And that's what we do as humans. We're very curious, and then that's what various disciplines do. So given this scenario, now there's unprecedented opportunity for every researcher to take web as a proxy to the real world. And this is unprecedented opportunity because the web has become a very good proxy to the real world. Whatever the conclusions that you can draw based on data analysis that you can do on web, and you map it back to the real world, most of them seem to be very, very true. For example, you can predict who will win in the elections based on the Twitter data alone, or just look at how the particular disease is spreading based on the conversations that are happening on one or two social networks. So web suddenly has become a very good proxy to the real world, and that actually motivates many of the people to actually reduce their hard work and then increase the quality of their research by relying on the data that is available. Right? So motivating that single aspect should be able to bring in several people into the same platform. So if you would like to talk about before and after scenario, for example, the marriage, before marriage and after marriage, people talk about how different life is, right? For a researcher, before really understanding other community, for example, in my life, talking to the sociologists and then the other philosophers of the similar discipline, change the entire perspective in terms of what is really priority. What are the way even you look at the problems, how you scope the problem, and how you should think about the solutions and all these aspects, right? So that is the important, the moment, the aha moment perhaps, that you actually realize, and then how enriched you are and how much bigger your vision is. And then if you are somehow able to communicate that to rest of the people and then enrich the community in a manner where it is all inclusive, perhaps the only formula that is working in the world is dividing people as much as possible. But this is the way where you are able to include people and then sort of move ahead with it. One last thing that I wanted to say in this regard is, sometime back IBM, in 1947, Watson famously said, there is a market for 5 computers in this world that IBM could make. And then later, I believe it's Prabhakar Raghavan, who was heading Yahoo research at that point in time. He said, yes, indeed, there are only 5 computers in the world. They are called Google, Yahoo, IBM, and Microsoft. And then later, somebody called Nicholas Carr, who is actually editor or one of the senior journalists in Wired magazine, he said, no, it's actually, there's only one computer that's called web. It has memory, it has machine computing power, and it has everything that is required so that we can program that one machine. And then, kind of get data, whatever that we want, and use the web as a large, big computer that will serve all your needs. In that way, Watson was off by 4, right? So, looking at this, now this one big computer that can serve that entire humanity and gives opportunities to everybody to use this big computer is something that's very exciting. And then, and also gives us other challenges, some of which were discussed. Many of us actually talked about the challenges that will come because the web has become much bigger than what you would like to accept and so on. But that's a different thing. But in terms of fostering this kind of a community, especially in Indian context, unless you bring in people who are not touched by it yet, that's the only way. And then this is a great opportunity for us, for all of us to use.
The one thing I would like to mention is Vasu is an interdisciplinary researcher. He can collaborate with himself in 2 different areas. So software engineering and machine learning and data mining and things. Right? So Niloy. And so is Niloy actually.
we are told there is only one machine. So I'm just try to take 2 minutes. And the first about the Indian web community. So what you have to realize is that web is still very young, and web is just coming out from elites, the techies. It is coming out from elites and techies, and it is going to the mass. So what has happened in the last, if you see 5, 6, 7 years, there are a lot of mechanisms which could be developed using web. Like if you think Ola Uber, it has come into reality because there is web. And this, if you just think of Ola Uber, even my mother is using Ola Uber. So somehow web has begun to go out from individual, a fixed number of elites, and it is going to the masses. And as soon as it going to the masses, there is a lot of like India specific work which needs to be done. And a community will become strong. Of course, we have to have conferences, bring people, bring all those things are there, and we have to do. But ultimately, if we can develop work which there is a possibility at this point, which will actually encompass a lot of people, a lot of the masses. And so I was just thinking, I just see some small things I will tell about, say, Google Maps. So Google Maps, yesterday we were coming and coming from Kharagpur to Kolkata, and Google Maps directed us to a path, and ours was like a 7-seater, and it took us to a road which can support at most a 2-seater. Okay. So because they are doing some sort of algorithms which are very specific to maybe advanced countries, they have not customized it, so these types of things are happening. And this is happening, this is not the first time it is happening to me. This thing I am noticing continuously. So one thing is language has been a very important thing, how to customize language, but also in various cases, how to take it to the masses, that is an important. The next thing which has happened about web, and which web science community also has to understand, that web we thought as just as a content, but web is also now a device. So there is a lot of things which we are doing through our mobile phone that is going to the web, and how we are using mobile phones is also very important, and that is actually an integral part of the web. So I guess this has to get integrated into web science to have the web science community, not only in India, all over the world, more vibrant, and this has to be understood by the community. So the third point is more philosophical, and it's more. So see, what happened is I think JP was telling a lot about the dystopia which we are facing, which may be a short-term dystopia, fake news, etc. But if you think when I think carefully, what I feel is there is a much more deeper philosophical jolt which is coming. Is that actually, if you think of our civilization is very much dependent upon printing sources. So we believe in Holy Script. So see, all the religions believe in Holy Script, but if you think when those religions were there, there was no Holy Script, because there was no printing press. Only when the printing press came, what was first published? Bible was published. Okay. So this was happening, that our entire civilization is actually dependent upon what is written. So we believe what is written, and we ask what is written, and that actually has come under threat. So this is a much more deeper threat than we think, that there is some fake news, we can solve some problem. May not be in the shorter run, may not be in the longer run. So this may be a threat, this may be an opportunity, but there is an entire shift, which I'm making a big statement, but there is an entire shift in how people believe, the rules which we follow among people. These are actually under threat, and these are actually under transformation. And we have to understand that the entire paradigm, how people are interacting, is under transformation, and then only I think we can actually target the small problems. If we target the small problem per se, we can get some temporary solutions, but the solutions will not be fixed.
So it looks like it's not just elections, but Google Maps also works differently in West Bengal. So I would ask Niyati to give her views, and I also like to point out that Adobe is no longer a document processing company. It's very much an internet web company than ever before.
So thanks for that introduction. First, it's extremely scary to be sitting here among so much experience. And so, like Raveendran said, Adobe is not just about Photoshop and documents. There is a large business that deals with enterprise digital data. Salesforce being one of the biggest competitors, actually. So, companies or product companies that like Adobe, which try to build features or products that are dependent on digital footprints or digital data of various different enterprises, are trying to put themselves in a place where they say that AI and ML are just not buzzwords. They are actual product features that are going to help my end customer. So it can be even doing simple recommendations or tracking anomalies or projecting sales on a Black Friday. So those kind of algorithms exist and are well grounded in the academia. And that is one reason why any corporate or an industry would like to be engaged in active, at least be aware of what goes on in academia so that we don't miss the boat. So that's one part. Another thing that I believe industry kind of brings in from the web space is the fact that for most of the problems that an industry is looking for or the customers of an industry face are actually due to the way web is today. So one of the problems, say, ESPN faces is that there is a cricket match and the number of visitors on their website just bloats up on the day of the cricket match and they don't know what to do about it. So they try to look for technological solutions where they want someone to tell them that tomorrow there will be a cricket match, your visitors will increase, please deal with that. Plus they also need to know that there are going to be fake bots that are going to come to the website. So there are very subtly different but different dynamics that come into play when there is some money involved. So you have Adobe, Adobe's customer is ESPN, ESPN will have visitors and Adobe's product will be used by ESPN. So you cannot just go out there and say that I have an algorithm with 90% accuracy and it will do a good job on that day. And that's where I would say a lot of the points that were put out today saying privacy, security, data leakage, fraud, all of those things actually come into play in practice. Switching gears, what I would like to sort of point out about is that being an industry researcher or representing a team of industry researchers, it is very easy for us to become myopic because our daily job is to identify what the product might need today, tomorrow. It is not only to identify where to publish next. And hence, it's a community like this is what is needed for us to be grounded. And I guess that is sort of a view from a researcher who would say 5 years ago finished PhD and would say, I really need to do my research. And the only way I can do research being in industry, good research being in industry is to be aware about what academia is doing today.
So
I think of you grounding us actually.
So I'll have one quick question, and see, this is a nice thing about putting panelists, all of whom have to leave at 4 o'clock to catch a flight, so that we can't run long, we have to end on time. But one quick question to the panel. So one of the biggest challenges I see in Indian academia and in Indian industry is that so people are very happy to stay in their comfort zones because they are able to keep producing whatever is their measurable metric for success, papers or patents and things like that, without having to ever step out of the comfort zone. So what is one thing that you would like to tell people that will make them be more, active in forums like this? Let's start with Niloy. Start with Boss.
Okay. I
meant it for the web science community, so
right.
It is not an open.
I have a very ready-made answer, time-tested answer. Your projects, the people who graduate from your groups with PhDs, MS, BTech reports, your publications, all of them should be byproducts. They should not be the main products. There's at a national level, the mission mode projects taken up by consortium of institutions working towards a single goal with accountability and responsibility. That's the most important. I cannot overemphasize on these two elements of being accountable and responsible for using public money, and have very concrete desirables, if not deliverables, of what you want to do in 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, without losing that long-term goals of what we have. There are plenty of examples in the West, for example, that would where a bunch of institutions and very committed individuals and their groups working towards one single goal of delivering something and closing that and making it available. And another thing, the closure is as important as the execution, where at the end of this project, whatever that you produce, whether it is data, algorithms, other modules, the know-how, all of that should be made available to everybody to build on. So this particular way of working, instead of what next paper that I can write, or rather, how do I get my PhD? If you think only at that level, overall the progress that we make is very, very slow. So this is the matter of aligning all the vectors. We have lots of magnitude, all of us have some direction, but this direction is not aligned. The moment all of it is aligned towards one single goal, we can achieve a lot more. There are good examples in India of achieving these goals. For example, in language technologies area, where 10 institutions are more collaborated. But then, of course, the one part that I want to emphasize is on the accountability and responsibility and proper closure. If whatever the lessons that we have learned earlier, if they can be used to do this, I think that's the best way to, that's my opinion.
I found everyone's comments really helpful and useful, and I think that I'm going to say something trite, but I think it's important. Meetings like this is what grows the community. It's weird when you're studying something virtual, and I loved your comment about how the web is a proxy for the world, which is why, because I said yesterday, if you remember, we're running a live experiment, and that's what we are doing. And in a sense, we are scientists of all different creeds and disciplines, whatever cultures, that are coming to this to study this live experiment or experiments. And somehow you need to come together as a community to get stronger. Another technique we've used in other parts, well, not just in other parts of the world, but at home as well, is the use of summer schools for students. And I think we were talking earlier about what we could do to help the community in India. More meetings, having a meeting like this, and they take a lot to organise, and doesn't always have to be Ravi organising it at in Chennai, but also summer schools are very effective ways to get PhD students thinking out of the box. So they're coming from very different backgrounds sometimes, with different problems that their main core PhD is about, but coming to a summer school, and I don't know what you'd probably run it in the winter in India. It'd be summer. It's always summer. When we go to Singapore for summer schools, it's always summer in Singapore, so it really doesn't. And so I would think we should, and I think the Web Science Trust could help by, because it's not, you can't expect students in India to fly around the world to join in other things that are going on because of the money and the culture sometimes and all that. So I think we should think about setting up, trying to help the community here set up some summer schools, a series of summer schools.
So yeah, first of all, I agree with you. Yeah, we need mission mode projects, not only to help the country build something. I'm not so much an optimist going by the country's situation, but that would actually build up a very good community. And that would actually build up a very good community. So, so this is obviously it should be done at the earliest. The second is about education, which Wendy is telling something. So I have a little bit outrageous comments about education. So there is an idea that we are computer scientists, we know some tools, and we should go to some political scientist and understand from those political scientists, and then the political scientist is the boss. He will give me the theory and I will try to plug into that theory. So this is the general perception. Sorry, I'm just so what is not clear to me, or what I feel, that I can understand what will happen from about the election by Twitter without even consulting you. Why should I even consider you? So there is a point which I am trying to tell. Pardon me, I am just a little bit harsh. But there is a point which I am trying to tell, is that many of the old disciplines are also under huge threat, and perhaps new disciplines will come up. That it will be a internet political history, something like that, which is nothing to do with that old political history. And education actually slowly has to cope up with that. I'm just telling you, the first thing which IIT system needs to do is, IIT system needs to have a lot of humanities courses. Here in IIT system, we laugh at humanity courses and just simply those courses are there where we oh, not yet. Yeah, that is very good. But most of the time, humanity courses are like time pass. So something of this has to come. So yeah, this is like what students feel. Am I wrong?
That's dreadful.
So this is something has to come, that it's not only technology, a new type of science is emerging. And education actually has to come up to this. And as long as it doesn't come up from the top, something should come up from the bottom. Each individual has to realize and take their coursework accordingly.
Actually, continuing from what Niloy said about multidisciplinary stuff. So there is an experiment that one of Vasu sir's student is running. And that problem requires a lot of humanity input. The day he goes for meetings with that faculty, he's done once the meeting is over. So he struggles in trying to convey what computer science, the way a computer scientist thinks about the same problem to that faculty. And he's been running an annotation task for, I think, a little more than a year now. Every time a new annotator comes, so these are expert annotators, it's related to some content and needs annotations and things like that. Every time a new annotator comes, he's like, 1 month gone, I need to train the annotator. Because these annotators are people who are doing their graduate studies in humanities. So while interdisciplinary stuff is really needed, I think it probably needs to start a little early at some grassroots level, where those guys also start understanding the technical jargon, and the technical guys also start understanding at least the jargon from the humanities side. Based on experience within our team itself, we are actually a group of people where there is a distribution between computer scientists, statisticians, econometricians, marketing science people, consumer behavior person. And there are days when statisticians and computer scientists fight just simply because someone says, I want to do a statistical significance analysis or some bias variance analysis, and someone else uses a particular statistical test as a name. And it's the same mathematical model, but even those sister disciplines don't agree. So I guess it's more of learning by experience kind of a problem as well. It's not just learning by teaching. So, yeah.
I think I will both support and then take issue with what you said, but I think generally, if I look at what all four of you have said, the biggest barrier and yet the biggest payoff that will come from web science is if we can solve this interdisciplinary. Okay? And it isn't easy, otherwise it would have been done. Right? I was talking to someone else earlier saying, ever since digital infrastructure rollout began, a guy called Andrew Abbott studied quite a lot of it, wrote a book called The System of Professions, that there is a blur taking place between disciplines that happens through the rollout of saying, like Andreessen may say software is eating the world, but before that, structured data started eating the world, and now unstructured data is going through. Voice and gesture and touch are bringing different experiences through. Image and video are sort of coming into it. Wendy sort of made her bones on multimedia, 30 years ago, or whatever. But these things are all coming back to saying that merger is requiring us to think of the skills differently. And the humanities represent quite a lot of places where the forced innumeracy, the qualitative aspects are good to bring in at the same time. So I think there is a lot of learning to do with the professions coming together. So there I would take issue with but you were seeking to be controversial, so no issue. But the other side, where I think the point you made again has been reflected in different forms, which is really important, is culturally we are used to a different world. Okay, when I teach about data, I say we are all grown up thinking of data as mother's home cooking. Okay, our trust level of the data is high. We think we know where it was prepared, who prepared it, what the ingredients were, what the recipe was, and why it's safe. But the world we live in, we are eating street food blindfolded with our hands tied behind our back and wondering why we're feeling so ill. Right? And that is a cultural transformation that has to take place, because we have placed a very high trust level. Right? You mentioned the printed word, but it's generally across, in large corporations. If it's there in PowerPoint, it's true. Right? If it's in an Excel spreadsheet, it's true. I'm sort of saying you have no idea where it came from, and the fact it was edited on the way to the meeting, right? At the edge. But those sort of disciplines to say, how do you know this has any value, that it has any meaning at all? And you could say a scientist is meant to be skeptic. Okay? In that case, many of the people in humanities may have to learn part of it to say, do not trust what you see. Okay? So this is not a one-way street to say, let's enumerate people more qualitative and more humane or something like that. There are many things where coming together will help. But what I was intrigued by, because these were the two things where I said I disagree with this, I agree with this, was the fact that there seemed to be resonance that the mission project was the sort of way to try to catalyze that. I think of the summer school to be a variant on mission project, but bottom up rather than top down. To say, if you can get 50 people who are on a mission as
Not
individuals.
all computer scientists.
No, but 50 people on a mission to change their little bit of the world or whatever, then the summer school model is a mission project, but just operating with a different grain. So I'm encouraged by what I've heard, even if, there was a bit of toing and froing within it.
Just to follow up on that while you get the mic. JP reminded me, I've always been interdisciplinary because in 1986 I started playing with putting video and photos and audios onto a computer. And I was told in no uncertain terms by a male, well, there weren't any female professors, by a professor in my department that there was no future for me either at Southampton or in computer science if I carried on with this work, because I wasn't writing a compiler or developing a programming language or whatever. I'm now a Dame, a Fellow of the Royal Society, a Regius Professor of Computer Science, and he's retired and his name is not remembered. So, if you think I'm just saying to people, if you think if you've got a vision, go with it, right? And don't give in to people who tell you can't do that.
I have a question. Good to see that the panelists are insisting on the goal-oriented byproducts, all that, and the interdisciplinary is also another topic that is going on. But on the other side, when we look at the curriculum is more theory-oriented, and students are concentrating only on the theoretical problems, and the students are lacking the skill on product-oriented. So do you think that some revision has to happen on the curriculum where the interdisciplinary kind of thing is stressed upon? I just want the comments from the panelists.
We actually, I've got to go in a minute. We teach, at Southampton, we teach interdisciplinary skills, not on undergraduate, but on our PhD program we do. On the undergraduate, we of course have things like ethics and the the courses that all computer scientists should have about how you build systems in the knowledge of what they may or may not do in the world. But we also teach interdisciplinary skills to faculty in terms of doing supervision that takes you across disciplinary boundaries. So we run courses for faculty on how to supervise an interdisciplinary PhD.
I think what Nosh told in it, it's not about diversity, it's about inclusion also. So somehow everybody has to realize, and it's not just giving 2 courses where student doesn't go. So that it's about somehow including and putting it inside the brain that this is.
No, I didn't have a comment specifically about this issue. I mean, I could say that one of the things that I think is really important is collaborative fluency. We live in a world where we have to be collaborating with other people. We can never be experts on it. Most of the problems, not all, but most of the problems of any particular area have mostly been solved. And so the problems we are talking about in the so-called interdiscipline of web science really does require us to be collaborating with other people. And, communication, everyone says, oh, you need to communicate well. I think the real challenge is how to collaborate and the fluency associated with that. And that really requires us to not ever believe what I know Niloy doesn't really believe, and that is that there is a hierarchy. It's so refreshing to hear Niloy say, oh, we are the computer scientists, and why should the political scientists be the people who get it? I spent my life hearing exactly the opposite argument, right? That the political scientists are the people who are sitting at the low children's table and the computer scientists are sitting at the high table. So it's kind of funny to hear you say exactly the opposite. But anyway, I know that we are out of time here, but I just wanted to take 10 seconds to thank the organizers and thank the hosts, and in particular thank Ravi and Srinath and Sridhar and others who have just done such an incredible job of bringing us all here together and to help do this. So.
And I thank all the speakers and all the participants who spent the last 2 days with us. and including the students who took time out and presented posters. I know some of them are doing this in between paper deadlines and things like that. So really, thank you. And I do hope that we can keep this going, and many more of you would volunteer and to bring it more inclusive audience for the next year's meeting.